In the spring of 2009, Adeline Pruitt, a woman of 28 with soiled dark hands and her grandmother's stubborn jaw, was told that the orchard her family had tended for 60 years was about to become a parking lot. She was not invited to the meeting. She was not sent a letter. A man in a gray wool coat appeared at her door on a Tuesday afternoon and handed her a laminated notice that smelled of toner and legal certainty. A national highway expansion project had been approved. Eminent domain proceedings were already underway. The 42 acres of apple, pear, and cherry trees that her grandmother had planted on a limestone ridge in the Cumberland Valley of Tennessee were now, in the language of that document, a matter of public interest. Let me tell you about that afternoon. Adeline read the notice standing in her doorway, the screen door propped open with her hip. The man who delivered it, a surveyor named Mr. Pennick, had the practiced expression of someone who delivered bad news professionally and had learned to make his face a kind of smooth, empty wall. He explained the timeline. He used phrases like just compensation and fair market assessment. He mentioned that a representative from the Development Authority, a Mr. Aldrich, would be in contact within the week to discuss the terms of the acquisition. Adeline handed the notice back to him. Mr. Pennick blinked. "Ma'am, you'll need that for your records. I have the address," she said. "I'll find the office myself." He looked at her the way people look at someone who doesn't yet understand that a decision has already been made. Then he got back in his truck and drove down the long gravel road, past the first row of apple trees, past the old cider shed, past the hand-painted sign her grandmother had put up in 1961 that read Pruitt Family Orchard, "You pick welcome." He did not look at any of it. Adeline went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the ridge, where the trees were just beginning to bud, that tentative pale green of early April, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, not grief. Something older and quieter than both. Something that felt like the ground itself deciding not to move. Now let me tell you something about Adeline before I go any further, because it matters. She had not always been here. She had gone away to school in Knoxville, studied landscape architecture, worked for 4 years at a design firm in Nashville, where she spent her days making other people's land beautiful. She was good at it. She understood the language of soil and slope and drainage, the way a hillside breathes, the way an old tree holds a landscape in place, the way a keystone holds an arch. She had come back to the orchard 3 years before, after her grandmother's health declined. She had meant to stay for 1 season. She had stayed because, as she would later say to anyone who asked, the land asked her to. Her grandmother, a woman named Bertie, had built the orchard from nothing. She had come to the ridge as a young bride in 1955, when the land was thin clay and scrub brush, and she had amended that soil by hand, year after year, trucking in compost and aged manure, planting cover crops through the winters, rotating her nitrogen-fixing clover through the rows. She had studied every apple variety as if it were a language she was learning. She had made mistakes. Whole rows had failed in bad years, but she had listened to what the land told her it needed, and slowly, the ridge had responded. The orchard that existed now, the one Mr. Pennick had driven past without looking, was the result of 54 years of that listening. Bertie had passed 8 months before the notice arrived. She had left the orchard to Adeline, not because Adeline was the oldest grandchild, but because she was the only one who had ever asked the right questions about it. The meeting with Mr. Aldrich happened on a Thursday morning at a county government building that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee. Mr. Aldrich was a compact, efficient man who wore reading glasses on a lanyard and carried a manila folder that was already thick with paperwork before Adeline had sat down. He had the demeanor of someone who considered himself fair, which can be the most dangerous thing in the world, because fair people rarely think they need to be questioned. He outlined the acquisition. The highway expansion required a right-of-way that ran directly through the lower 30 acres of her property. A secondary access road would take 6 more. The remaining 6 acres of ridge, the highest and oldest block of trees, would be rendered inaccessible, effectively landlocked by the new infrastructure. The assessed compensation, Mr. Aldrich said, sliding a page across the table, reflects current agricultural land values for the county, plus a percentage for what we've categorized as operating business loss. Adeline looked at the number without touching the paper. That valuation, she said, is based on commodity land prices. It reflects standard market rates. Yes, this isn't standard land, she said. This is a heritage or the oldest tree on the property is 61 years old. It took my grandmother 30 years to get some of those varieties producing consistently. You cannot replace that with money. You cannot plant a tree and wait 60 years and call that equivalent. Mr. Aldrich removed his reading glasses and set them on the table with the patience of a man who has heard versions of this before. Mrs. Pruitt. Miss Pruitt, I understand the sentimental dimension here. I do. But the assessment is based on legal parameters that I'd like to see the full environmental impact study, Adeline said, specifically the section on mature canopy preservation and watershed impact. There was a pause, a small telling pause. That documentation is a matter of public record, Mr. Aldrich said carefully. Yes, she agreed. I know. She stood, picked up her coat, and left. The subsequent 18 months were, by any external measure, a punishment. The Development Authority was not cruel, but it was relentless. And relentlessness is its own kind of pressure. Surveys happened at the edges of her property at dawn. Orange stakes appeared in her lower orchard. Preliminary grading work on the adjacent county road threw dust clouds over her trees through the summer, and by August, a thin gray film had settled on every leaf, slowing the photosynthesis of the very trees she was trying to save. The you-pick visitors that had come every fall since her grandmother opened the orchard, the same families, year after year, the kind of customers who called ahead to ask which varieties were ready. They still came, but they came the way you visit something you're afraid of losing. They came with a heaviness to them. They took more photographs than usual. They stayed longer. They lingered in the rows in the way people linger in places they're saying goodbye to. The county was not unkind about it. People she had known her whole life would stop her in the hardware store or the feed supply and lower their voices and say things like, "Honey, you know we love what you're doing out there, but sometimes things are just bigger than one person." Or, "Your grandmother was a fighter too." Or, "But there comes a point." They meant well. They meant every word. And they were watching her the way small towns watch the ones they're not sure about, with a mixture of pride and apprehension and the quiet hope that they wouldn't have to watch someone they liked get hurt. There was a night, late in the 2nd October, when the apprehension almost won. She had spent the day in a preliminary hearing with the county, her lawyer sitting beside her with the briefcase full of documentation about heritage varieties and soil microbiome studies and watershed buffer zones. The hearing had gone as hearings tend to go, politely, procedurally, and in a direction that felt inexorable. Her lawyer, a careful man named Mr. Briggs, who had handled her grandmother's estate and believed in what she was doing but was honest about the odds, had driven her home without saying much. He didn't have to. That night, after he left, she walked out to the ridge. It was cold. The harvest was 3 weeks over. The trees stripped bare. The upper orchard in October is a particular kind of beautiful. The skeleton shapes of old trees against a slate gray sky, the ground below them soft with fallen leaves, the air smelling of must and cold stone and the last of the year's fermentation. It's a beauty that has something of grief in it. She had always found it comforting. That night, she was not sure. She stood at the top of the ridge, where the oldest block grew, a cluster of antique varieties her grandmother had sourced from a nursery that no longer existed. 37 trees, some of them with trunks wider than her own arm span. The thought that hit her standing there, in the cold, looking at those trees in the dark, was this. She was 31 years old, and she had spent three years of her working life on a legal battle she was likely to lose for a piece of land that a development authority could take from her with the full blessing of the law. Her phone was in her coat pocket. In her email was an unopened message from a landscape architecture firm in Asheville that had reached out 6 months ago about a senior design position, salary, benefits, work she was good at. She held the phone. She looked at the trees. And then she put the phone back in her pocket because one of the oldest trees, a wine sap that her grandmother had planted the year she arrived on that ridge, had dropped a single apple in the cold. She heard it fall, a quiet, certain sound, like punctuation, like the land making a point. She went back down to the house, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table until morning. She did not doubt again. Let me tell you what had been happening, quietly in parallel while the hearings dragged on. Adeline was a landscape architect by training, which meant she had spent 4 years learning to read land as a system. She knew what the orchard's root network was doing in that hillside. The way 60 years of deep root channels had made that limestone ridge a slow, efficient sponge, releasing water into the valley creek below through the dry months, buffering the lower fields from runoff in heavy rain. She had hired a hydrologist 18 months earlier, a professor from the University of Tennessee named Dr. Bassett, to document it. The study had taken 6 months and produced a 30-page report that was filed with the State Environmental Review Board, the County Water Authority, and the Army Corps of Engineers simultaneously. The highway project, the report concluded, if constructed as designed through the lower orchard, would eliminate a 4.2-acre permeable buffer zone and redirect seasonal stormwater flows in a way that posed measurable flood risk to a residential neighborhood 3/4 of a mile downstream. Mr. Aldrich, to his credit, had read the report. He had also referred it to the state DOT's environmental compliance team, who had read it and who had then spent 4 months arguing internally about it. The original design had not been modified, but a small, significant thing had happened. A line item had appeared in the project's compliance documentation, acknowledging the watershed concern and noting it as a matter for ongoing review. That was the door Adeline had left open by knowing what questions to ask. Now, here is the part of the story where the orchard itself stepped in. In the fall of that second year, while the legal process ground through its gears, something else was happening on the ridge. It started the way these things always start, with a single stranger asking a question. A woman had driven out from Nashville with her husband to pick apples. She was a food writer. She had heard about the Pruitt orchard from a chef she was profiling, a man who sourced his late-season apples, a variety called Newtown Pippin, tart and dense, the kind that holds its shape through a braise, exclusively from Adeline's upper block. The writer had come expecting a pleasant afternoon. She had stayed for 3 hours. She had watched Adeline move through the rows, explaining the varieties with the specificity and love of someone describing members of her own family. She had eaten a pippin off the tree and stood very still for a moment, the way people stand when something tastes the way they forgot food could taste. She had asked, before leaving, if Adeline ever hosted dinners. "I've thought about it," Adeline said. "You should," the writer said. "I would come back for that." The article ran in a regional food magazine in November, 4 pages, photographs of the ridge in harvest light, and a line near the end that said, simply, "This orchard should not be allowed to disappear." Adeline had not asked for the article. She had not orchestrated it. She had simply answered the woman's questions the way her grandmother had taught her, to talk about the land, with honesty and without performance. But the article found its audience. By December, Adeline had received over 200 emails, chefs, food writers, teachers who wanted to bring school groups, families who had picked at the orchard as children and were now parents themselves. A professor of agricultural history from Vanderbilt who asked if he could bring his graduate seminar to study the heritage varieties. A woman from Vermont who had been trying to source wine sap cuttings for years and didn't know such an old-growth source existed. And critically, 3 letters from environmental advocacy groups who had read the hydrologist's report and wanted to discuss the watershed issue in more formal terms. Adeline read every email. She said yes to the school groups. She said yes to the school groups. She said yes carefully, and after consultation with Mr. Briggs, to the environmental groups. The following spring, she opened the orchard in a new way. She built a long table, not a structure, just an actual table, 12 feet of reclaimed barnwood, set up in the upper orchard on Saturday afternoons from May through November. She served one thing. Whatever the orchard had ready that week, early May meant apple blossom tea and preserves from the previous autumn. June meant the first cherries, picked that morning, alongside a simple bread her grandmother had made. As the summer deepened, the table deepened with it. Pears in August, the first pippins in September. By October, the table held everything, and people drove 3 hours for it. She charged $40 a person. She capped it at 24 guests. She had a waiting list within 6 weeks. Now, let me stop and ask you something directly. Have you ever watched someone create something irreplaceable? And I mean something that cannot be duplicated by money or planning or any amount of industry, from what was simply already there, because that is what I'm describing. Adeline did not invent a product. She did not develop a concept. She revealed something that had been true about that ridge for 60 years and had simply been waiting for the right set of eyes and hands to make it legible to the rest of the world. The table on the ridge became in a sing-sigul-sisi, the kind of place people whispered about, not loudly, not in the way of hype or trend, which is to say they told the people they trusted, most which a chef mentioned it to another chef. A grandmother told her daughter. A college professor included it on a syllabus as a field visit, and his students came back and brought their families the following fall. The Vanderbilt seminar happened in March. 14 graduate students in agricultural history spent 2 days on the ridge with Adeline, documenting rootstock, photographing bark patterns, recording variety names in a spreadsheet that would eventually become part of a regional biodiversity database. One of the students, a young woman named, but I'm getting ahead of myself. What matters is what that visit produced, a formal nomination of the Pruitt Orchard to the Tennessee Agricultural Heritage Registry, submitted by the university, supported by documentation that Adeline had spent 3 years quietly assembling without knowing at the time exactly what she was building toward. The nomination was approved in June. Mr. Aldrich called her the following Monday. His voice, over the phone, had a different quality than it had in that county building 2 years earlier, less the smooth efficiency of a man who considers himself fair, more the careful quality of a man revising his understanding of a situation. The Heritage Registry designation, he said, creates some complications with the current acquisition framework. I imagine it does, Adeline said. We'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss a modified right-of-way proposal. I'm available Thursday, she said. Same office as before. The modified proposal, when it came, was significant. The highway project was not canceled, but the right-of-way was redesigned, more expensive, substantially more expensive. Would carry the new road above the lower orchard rather than through it. The secondary access road was rerouted to the north property line, away from the orchard blocks entirely. The 6 acres that had been deemed effectively landlocked were now fully accessible. The total acreage disturbed, 1.5 acres on the far eastern edge, where the trees were youngest and the heritage value lowest. It was not a perfect outcome. That eastern edge had been her grandmother's most recent planting, rows of a newer variety she had been experimenting with. Adeline had walked those rows 100 times. She knew each tree. She grieved them with the particular grief of someone who understands that a tree takes time and there is no shortcut for it. But the ridge stood. The old winesap stood. The pippins, the Newtown, the maiden blush, and the Roxbury russet, the varieties that existed in that valley, in that soil. Because of 61 years of her grandmother's attention, they stood. She signed the modified agreement on a Thursday afternoon, in the same room where Mr. Aldrich had first slid that compensation page across the table to her. He shook her hand when it was done, and this time he did not have the manner of a man who considered himself fair. He had the manner of a man who had been educated. "Your hydrologist's report," he said, holding her hand a moment longer than a handshake requires. "That was very thorough work. My grandmother always said you have to understand what you're defending before you can defend it," Adeline told him. He nodded slowly. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Adeline said. She listened. "Let me tell you what happened after." The table on the ridge did not go away when the legal fight ended. If anything, it deepened. The Heritage Registry designation brought a different kind of visitor, people with a specific kind of hunger for something the modern food system doesn't easily provide, which is provenance. The knowledge of not just what you're eating, but where it began, who tended it, what the soil remembers. Adeline began offering something she called tree adoptions. For an annual fee, a family could adopt one of the heritage trees, receive a wooden plaque with the tree's variety name and planting year, a visit each season to check on their tree, and a share of that tree's annual yield. The first year, she offered 12 adoptions, mostly to families who had been coming to the orchard for years. They sold out before she finished writing the announcement. The second year, she offered 20. Same result. By the third year, there was a 2-year waiting list. The chef who had first sent the food writer to the ridge, his name was Mr. Kowalczyk, a quiet, serious man who ran a small restaurant in Nashville that didn't take reservations and didn't need to. He began sourcing entirely from Adeline. He listed the variety name and the harvest date on his menu the way a winery lists its vintage. His regulars asked about the orchard. He started bringing them on informal visits, small groups, when the orchard was quiet, on Tuesday mornings, when the orchard was quiet, and in a development that Adeline would later describe as the thing that would have made her grandmother laugh the longest and loudest, the highway authority itself. The same office that had sent Mr. Pennock to her door with that laminated notice included the Pruitt Orchard in the public interest signage for the completed road project. And the Spix, a brown heritage marker, the kind you see for historical sites and scenic overlooks, was installed at the exit ramp nearest the ridge. It read, Pruitt Family Orchard, Est, 1955, Tennessee Agricultural Heritage Site. Drivers exiting the highway she had fought could now follow the signs to her gate. The irony of it settled over the valley like the first morning frost, quiet, total and clarifying. Now, Adeline Pruitt is in her early 40s. Her hands are still dark with soil. She still drives the same truck she was driving when Mr. Pennick came to her door, though it has more rust on the wheel wells now, and the heater takes 20 minutes to get warm. The orchard is certified heritage, debt-free, and operating with a waiting list for every experience she offers, from U-Pick to the Saturday table, to the tree adoptions, to the school programs that bring 100 children a year to the Ridge to learn what an apple tree looks like in every season of its life. The elevated viaduct that carries the highway above her lower orchard is visible from the Ridge on a clear day. Adeline has said to the few people who asked her directly about it that she does not mind it, that it looks, in a certain light, like the highway bowing. The winesap her grandmother planted in 1955, the one that dropped an apple in the cold on the night Adeline stood on the Ridge with her phone in her hand, is still producing, slowly, in the way of old trees that have earned the right to their own pace. It bore a small crop 2 autumns ago, and Adeline pressed it separately, a single batch of 12 bottles of raw cider that she has not sold and will not sell. She stores them in the root cellar below the old cider shed, in the dark and the cool, next to a framed photograph of her grandmother, standing in the lower orchard in 1962, a piece of sweet grass held between her teeth, her eyes squinting in the summer light. On quiet Saturday evenings in October, after the last guests have gone and the Ridge is still and the stars are beginning to show above the limestone bluff, Adeline sometimes walks up to the upper orchard alone. She runs her hand along the trunk of the old winesap. The bark is rough and deeply furrowed, the way bark gets when a tree has been standing long enough to know weather. She doesn't say anything to it. She just stands there for a while, listening. She learned that from her grandmother. The listening, the men in the government offices, came with their laminated notices and their manila folders and their careful, fair language. They saw an obstacle. They saw a legal and logistical problem to be managed. They thought the story was about a road that needed to be built. They were wrong. The story was always about the Ridge. The road was just a complication, a loud and expensive chapter in a much longer, quieter book. They said the orchard was a matter of public interest. It turned out they were right about that, just not in the way they meant. The land remembered who had listened to it, and it made sure everyone else remembered too.